Over the years, Norfolk, Virginia has transformed from a seaside town into a bustling mid-Atlantic business and military hub. But for 16-year-old Natalie Purdy, Norfolk feels worlds away from the gritty streets she's grown up on.
I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, in a section called East New York, which is a kind of rough area in Brooklyn. You may see robbery, you may see a murder, you may see a drug deal.
After her mom gets mugged in the elevator of their apartment building, Natalie's parents decide it's safer to send their daughter south to live with her grandmother.
What do you think?
It's a lot different than the city.
You think you can handle all the peace and quiet? There are my girls. Come give your grandma a kiss.
Hi, Grandma.
Oh, it's lovely to see you.
You too.
I got the spare room all fixed up for you.
Okay.
Used to be your room.
I bet you haven't changed a thing.
Hey, dear.
Hey, sweetheart. I can't believe how quiet it is out here.
Oh, you'll get used to it. We'll make a country girl out of you yet.
Compared to New York, it was like country. It was much slower, and you didn't see crime. So living in Virginia, I thought it would be a lot safer than living in New York.
Natalie spends the last week of her summer preparing for school and the dance team tryouts.
I started dancing at the age of 8 or 9. Dance was my life. I would eat, sleep, and drink dance. It was like a way to escape, and it was just an enjoyment.
Is everything all right?
I think someone's out there.
Out where?
Out in the woods. I heard a rustling.
You are such a city girl. It's probably just some critter. It's fine.
Living in New York, there was always police, sirens, ambulance, fire, just the traffic, the noise. So when I first moved to Virginia, I couldn't sleep at night because it was so quiet.
But as school gets underway, Natalie quickly finds her footing when she lands a spot on the dance squad.
Bye, guys. See you tomorrow. Great rehearsal.
I was just getting used to being in a new school. But dancing, it just helped me to get to know people better without even having to reach out to try and make friends.
But as Natalie heads home from practice one night, her streetwise instincts kick in and her guard goes up.
Hey, sorry. I didn't mean to scare you.
No, it's okay.
So you're a dancer?
How'd you know that? Oh. Right. Well, I guess I'd better get going.
Hey, I don't mean to be too forward or anything, but do you need a ride? I mean, it's dark and I'd be happy to drive you.
Thanks, but my grandmother's picking me up.
Okay. I'm Kevin, by the way.
Natalie.
And if you ever change your mind about that ride, just give me a call.
Okay. Thanks. I will.
When I met Kevin, I was 16 going on 17. And my first impression of him was that he was handsome and he was older. So that was an attraction for me because he was just more mature.
But romance isn't a priority for Natalie. Her focus remains firmly on dance.
Hey, Grandma, it's me. I thought you were picking me up for dance practice. No, it's okay. I'll get a ride. I'll see you later for dinner, okay? Okay, bye.
Determined to make it to dance practice, Natalie remembers Kevin's offer, and she decides to take him up on it.
Hi, I don't know if you remember me. It's Natalie, the dancer. Yes, I was wondering if you could give me that ride to dance practice. Yeah? Okay, all right, okay, thanks, bye.
I started calling Kevin for rides to dance practice, and we started talking on the phone. So that's how our relationship started.
And the more time Natalie and Kevin spend together, the closer they get.
Thanks. So it's just the kind of book that has everything. I love it.
I'm not much of a reader, but it sounds interesting.
Oh, I think I got it right here. Yep, here, try it. I think you'll really like it.
Okay, thanks. It may take me a while to get through it, but...
Take as long as you need.
Okay.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Kevin was just as supportive. He would drive me to dance rehearsal. He would pick me up. A lot of times he may even wait and be at the whole rehearsal, but we were just friends.
But not everyone thinks Natalie's friendship with Kevin is a good idea.
Hey, Grandma, what are you doing out here?
You be careful you're not leading that young man on.
What do you mean? I'm not leading him on. We're just friends.
You sure he sees it that way?
Yes, Grandma. You're so old-fashioned.
Matters of the heart don't change, honey. Old-fashioned or not. I've been around long enough to know when a man is interested in a woman. You need to take a step away from that boy. You might think he's just a friend, but he ain't gonna see it that way. Well, I'll switch my church schedule around and drive you to rehearsal myself, okay?
Okay.
Good, okay.
My grandmother was very adamant about you don't play with people's emotions and to be careful as far as to accept any kind of favors from guys because they may look into it more. So I was trying to be cautious that I didn't make Kevin think that it was more to it. I wasn't prepared to have a full-on relationship.
As the school year progresses, Natalie continues to form new friendships.
She's a social butterfly. People love Natalie. She has that personality, that bubbly personality, and a smile that you don't forget.
I'm gonna get out of here. My feet are killing me. I'll see y'all later. Okay, bye.
Hey, you're a dancer, right? Because I think I've seen you around before. Oh, my brother, he's a dancer too.
Yeah, I'm a dancer. I've got the bumps and bruises to prove it too.
You should try massaging some rosemary oil.
Rosemary oil.
Yeah, it works great for my brother, and I'm on track, so it works great for me too.
I might have to try that. I don't mean to be rude, but I have to get going. It was nice meeting you.
Oh, Marcus. My name's Marcus.
I'm Natalie. I'll see you later.
I hope so.
Marcus's brother was also in dance, and we would all hang out after our performances. Marcus was very caring, he was funny, and I liked him.
And it doesn't take long for Natalie and Marcus to form a tight bond.
Thanks for hanging out with me today, Marcus. I really needed this break.
Hey, if you ever need to blow off steam, you know who to call.
Thanks.
Marcus and I grew very close. He treated me with a lot of respect, and he was very supportive, and I liked that about him as well.
All right, well, I should get going. I gotta get home for dinner.
Okay.
See you, Nat.
Bye.
Bye.
Immersed in school, dance, and her expanding circle of friends, Natalie doesn't see there's trouble brewing ahead until it's too late.
This traumatic event, it just came out of nowhere. This is something that should not happen with someone you love.
New York City native Natalie Purdy's first year in Norfolk looks like it's off to a great start, but looks can be deceiving.
Kevin.
Hey, sorry I called your name. I guess you didn't hear me?
No, it's fine. You just scared me.
The more that I started to hang out with Marcus and we grew closer, the less I saw of Kevin. I didn't even really talk to Kevin on the phone anymore.
How have you been? It's been forever.
You know, a little of this, a little of that. Staying busy. Oh, hey, I found this in my car. It's yours.
Oh, yeah, right. Did you like it?
Loved it. Thanks, and sorry it took me so long to get it back to you.
No, it's fine.
Hey, we should do something sometime. It's been a while.
Yeah, that sounds good. Guess I'll see you around?
All right, see you around.
It could be several weeks, and then I may call and say, oh, hey, or he may call and say, what you got going on? So I guess at that point, he was probably preoccupied with something else as well.
But as Kevin fades in and out of her life, Natalie's friend Marcus remains a constant presence.
Hey, Nat.
Hey. It's not even Christmas yet.
Go ahead, open it.
Oh my God, these are tickets to the Nutcracker?
Yeah.
Marcus, thank you.
Oh, and that's a national production, and I got us seats right in the orchestra section.
Oh my God, that's amazing. I can't wait, I'm excited.
Right?
Oh no, these are for the 21st.
Yeah, Saturday the 21st. It's gonna be amazing.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Marcus, I can't go. I have a dance recital the 21st.
But this is the Nutcracker.
Yeah, I know. Marcus, I'm sorry. You have to find someone else to go.
But no, I got them for you. Well, you can't miss one recital.
No, Marcus, I can't. I'm sorry.
All right, whatever.
As I was hanging out with Marcus more and more, I started thinking about my future and making dance a career. My dream was always to dance for a professional troupe. And so at that point, it was the most important thing to me over everything else.
And Natalie's dreams of becoming a professional dancer are about to take a major leap in the right direction.
Hello?
Thanks. All right, bye. I got the audition.
Congratulations! Just to receive the training through that school would just take me to a whole nother level. It would just allow me so many more opportunities.
And with a big audition ahead of her, Natalie makes a tough decision.
Because dance was so important to me, I started realizing that I wanted to only have my focus on dance. And so I came to the decision that I needed to tell Marcus that.
Marcus, I'm gonna have to work really hard to get ready for this audition.
Okay, you always work hard.
No, I mean, this is different.
All right, what are you trying to say?
We can still hang out, but I'll have to focus on dance full time. I hope that you can understand.
I mean, yeah, I understand you care more about dance than about me.
Marcus, you've always been a really good friend, and that means a lot to me.
Friend? Okay, Natalie. All right, I'll see you later.
Marcus was really upset about it. Marcus didn't take that well.
With her audition approaching, Natalie is determined to push herself as hard as she can, even if it means longer practices and late nights.
Bye, y'all. Have a good night.
And by the time Natalie leaves practice, her fellow dancers are long gone and she's alone. Or at least she thinks she is.
Kevin, I didn't recognize your car.
Hey, sorry. Yeah, I bought myself a new one. What do you think?
It's nice.
Well, I was nearby and I thought I'd drop in and say, hey, I was about to leave. I thought I'd miss you.
Oh, no, I'm practicing late all week for this audition in New York.
You are going to ace that audition.
Don't jinx me.
No, you're gonna do great.
Thanks.
Hey, you want to ride for old time's sake?
Sure.
Okay.
We ended up going to the movies. And from there, Kevin and I started dating.
But for Natalie, dancing remains her #1 priority, and she makes that clear to Kevin.
I started reminding him, I don't want to be in a serious relationship. And so throughout us dating, even though we were getting closer, I wanted to make sure it wasn't a mixed signal. But Kevin appeared that it didn't bother him at all.
So how's dance going?
It's good. I have a dance recital next Saturday.
Great. I'll be there.
You don't have to.
I want to.
You know I'm gonna have to practice late all week. You probably won't even see me.
Yeah, I know. Dancing comes first.
Kevin and I never had any drama. It was like a relief that, whew, okay, he believes in me, he trusts me. So that was another good thing.
What?
That sure would look good on you.
Maybe, but it probably costs a fortune, so.
So, I've got money.
I don't want you spending your money on me.
Why not? I mean, one day we'll be married and everything that's mine will be yours anyway.
Married?
I mean, one day.
When he stated if we were to get married, I took it as two friends just talking about what if and the future. And I really thought, you mean years from now. I'm not thinking that you mean in this year, in a few months.
You're lying.
But plans can change, and so can people.
Great, no, that's perfect. I'll be ready. Yes, I'm wearing the dress. Okay, see you soon. Grandma, you back already? Grandma, is that you? Grandma?
Natalie Purdy is getting ready for a date when an old friend pays her an uninvited visit.
Marcus, what are you doing here?
I know, I'm sorry. Your door is open. Well, you look good. But you got a date or something?
Marcus, he would pop up sometimes. He would always want to make an excuse to come over.
Marcus, what is it?
Yeah, these are for you.
What are those?
The pictures. I just figured you might want them.
No, Marcus, I don't. You need to leave.
Look, I miss you, Natalie. Like, I just want to talk, all right?
Marcus, we've already talked. There's nothing else to say. Stay right here.
Hey, babe, you need to get your things. You ready to go?
Kevin, this is my old friend Marcus. He was just leaving.
How you doing, Marcus?
Yeah. Old friend. That's all I am. All right, well, I'll see you later, Natalie.
So now I'm really feeling bad for Kevin because he just came to take me on a date and he sees that Marcus is there. So I want to assure him that, again, I'm not playing with anyone's emotions. I'm not trying to take advantage of him.
Look, I know how this looks.
It's okay.
There's nothing going on between us.
You don't have to explain anything to me. I trust you.
Okay.
Let's go.
Okay.
I'm thinking, wow, Kevin is so mature. And I was really pleased at the fact that he didn't show any kind of anger. He wasn't mad at me. He wasn't even mad at Marcus.
And Natalie's about to learn that Kevin has big plans for their relationship.
Hello.
Where were you earlier? I came by the house and no one was there.
You did? Oh, I'm sorry. My grandma and I just went to the store. We must have just missed you.
Oh. Okay. Well, pretty soon I won't have to worry about finding you. You'll be right at home with me.
Yeah, I guess. Someday.
Someday soon.
And Kevin says to me, you know, soon you're gonna have to get ready to start packing to move in with my parents and I. In my mind, I'm thinking, this is not such a great idea.
Natalie, time for dinner.
Okay, well, my grandma's calling me for dinner, so I'll call you back later, okay?
And then about a week and a half goes by. And Kevin and I, we don't talk about it anymore.
But Natalie isn't prepared for what happens next.
Okay, girl, pull yourself together.
Natalie?
Yeah?
Kevin's here.
Okay. Hey, what's with the boxes?
Somebody's got to help you pack up for our move, since you're not doing it.
And then he started talking about, oh, my parents are getting a new house built, and it'll be a larger house. And so if we were to get married, you could move in. And I just start trying to process what he has just said to me. And I'm almost like panicked.
Okay, Kevin, I think we need to talk.
What's going on?
I feel like things have been moving really fast, and I don't know, I think we should take a break.
I don't understand.
I'll be going to New York soon for my audition, and I'll be staying with my parents for a while.
Well, New York's only a few hours away.
Kevin, I think this will give us a chance to have some time to ourselves. Clear our heads.
But I love you. And I thought you loved me too. I thought we were going to get married.
I just was like, oh my goodness, this guy is not really getting this. So I started going into more details. My family will not give their approval for this marriage because I'm only 18. I haven't lived life yet. And so I said to him, I said, you know what? I really don't want you to think that I used you.
Here. I want to give this stuff back. I really wouldn't feel right keeping it.
But I thought we were just taking a break.
Yeah, we are. It's just...
Natalie, I love you. I love you.
The more I came up with something of why not, Kevin came up with, but why Natalie, I love you. And I'm not even really looking at him because I feel so bad at this point.
Kevin, I love you too, but that doesn't change anything. No, please. I think we should just... Ow!
And I look and I realize that he had stabbed me with the scissors.
I love you.
Kevin?
I love you.
Ow, Kevin, stop! Okay, Kevin, stop, please! Kevin, stop! Ah!
I'm now on the ground. And I'm trying to get away from him.
Please, Kevin, stop. Kevin, stop, please. Please, I'll do whatever you want, Kevin. Kevin, stop, please.
Natalie?
Her grandmother heard her screaming and hollering and went to go see what it was.
Kevin, stop.
She saw Natalie on the floor and blood everywhere, and she went to go call the police.
Oh, my God.
As she left out of the room, Kevin went back to stabbing me.
What's your emergency?
We need help. It's my granddaughter. He's trying to kill her.
The only time he stopped was once he heard her on the phone calling the police.
It's in the back. 325 Cherry Street.
So, once he heard her calling the police and giving his description, he ran out.
Oh, baby. It's gonna be all right. Help is coming. Help is coming.
My body has gone into shock. Now I black out.
Brutally attacked out of nowhere by her boyfriend Kevin Bullock, Natalie Purdy is fighting to stay alive.
He stabbed me over 30 times. I was in the hospital, and I was unconscious. My parents, our entire family, they were just praying that I was going to survive. And they tried to keep me heavily sedated because anytime somebody came in or any noise, anything, I would scream.
To go see her, and when I opened the door, she thought it was him.
Get away from me! Get away from me! Get away from me!
Desiree, look at me.
She was so traumatized, she thought I could have been him, even after hearing my voice.
Natalie, it's me. It's Desiree. It's Desiree. You're okay. He can't get you here. You're safe.
She just feared for her life that he was gonna come and finish her off or come and hurt her again. It was really hard to see her like that.
Natalie's injuries leave her temporarily paralyzed. She faces a long and grueling road to recovery.
You're doing great, baby. Let's try again tomorrow.
No, I want to try again today.
Okay.
It affected me walking, that affected me reading and writing. I had to learn all over again. They told me that I would never be able to dance again. That was the worst. That was the worst. It's just something that I couldn't imagine my life without.
I'm going to get some coffee. If your father calls, tell him I'll be back soon.
Hello.
Natalie. It's me.
And he said, hello, Natalie, this is Kevin. Instantly, fear has set in.
I've been trying to reach you. I'm in an institution, did I tell you? But I'm going to be okay. We're going to be okay. Are you there?
Kevin wasn't in jail. He told me he checked himself into the mental hospital, and that's where he was at.
As soon as you get out of the hospital, we can get married. Okay?
He only wanted to know one thing. Are we still gonna get married? And that let me know where his mindset was. It didn't matter about me or how I was feeling or what he did to injure me.
I look forward to putting all of this behind us. I'll see you real soon.
So I had to just lay there in fear, worried if he was gonna come and try and kill me.
To Natalie's relief, Kevin is released from a psychiatric hospital and arrested on charges of aggravated malicious wounding.
In Virginia, the malicious wounding charge is generally used versus the attempted murder. It's a felony, and it carries penitentiary time if convicted.
With Kevin facing prison time, Natalie can finally breathe a sigh of relief, but she decides to move back to New York to continue her recovery.
I felt safe in New York because it's such a big city. I felt protected because I knew that I had my family there.
But less than a year after her attack, Natalie and her family learn that Kevin has cut a plea deal with prosecutors.
The charge of malicious wounding was reduced to a lesser charge of unlawful wounding.
The lawyer told my mother, don't worry, he's gonna get jail time. He didn't.
In the end, Kevin Bullock walks away with only 4 years of probation.
It was like basically what the courts did to me was basically they said to me, who cares? Nobody cares. So what? I just cry in my room every day, every night. Because I felt like if I had died, then it wouldn't matter, but because I didn't matter.
Over the next 20 years, Natalie does her best to move on and build a new life for herself.
I did move back to Virginia. I got married, I had children, and my husband, he was a bodybuilder. And so I knew he was bigger than Kevin. So I felt protected. And while I was married, I never ever ran into Kevin. He went into the military. So he was gone.
But after Natalie and her husband divorced, trouble lies in wait.
And I remember going shopping right down the street from my house. And I was walking down the aisle, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up and said, like, whatever you do, don't turn around. And that's when I really felt like, oh my God, like, who is behind me? And I stopped and I acted like I was looking at something on the shelf. And I looked out the corner of my eye, and just as I turned my head, it was Kevin. That reignited my fear 100%.
And it's only a matter of time before Kevin strikes again.
Told you I'd be back.
In 1986, Natalie Purdy is attacked and almost dies at the hands of her then-boyfriend, Kevin Bullock. And in 2010, Kevin carries out yet another savage attack. But this time, he picks a new target.
Natalie Purdy?
Yes?
I'm Detective Patty Munley with the Virginia Beach Police Department. I'd like to talk.
She told me that he had done it again. Kevin had assaulted his ex-girlfriend, and the crime was so severe they didn't believe that this was his first attack on someone.
Detectives ran his criminal record, and where they saw the previous malicious wounding, they looked into the victim on that case, which was Natalie.
The way your case was resolved was wrong. Kevin should have gone away for a long, long time. So we'd like to make sure that he goes to jail forever. And maybe you could help, if you'd be willing to testify against him.
Yes.
My first reaction was, I'll do it. I'll do it. There was like no doubt. There was no hesitation.
Kevin pleads guilty to aggravated malicious wounding, but Kevin's attorney asks for leniency and blames his violence on PTSD. But prosecutors know Kevin's history of violence precedes his military service, and to prove it, they enlist Natalie's help as a surprise witness.
It's time. You ready?
Ready as I'll ever be.
You can do this, Natalie.
The entire courtroom was shocked to see me. Kevin glanced at me, and then he just continued to whisper to his lawyer. He wouldn't look at me. He kept his head down the entire time.
I believe Natalie's testimony in the sentencing hearing was really valuable. It validated the fact that Kevin was a violent offender, that this was repeat history of his behavior, and that the courts would see that this was not a good person that had lived a good life and joined the military and became a veteran that we all should be proud of. Natalie showed the other side of Kevin, and this is what needed to happen for a more harsh and severe and just punishment for his second offense.
50-year-old Kevin Bullock is sentenced to 35 years in prison, almost double Virginia State Sentencing Guidelines recommendation.
It was the first time that I felt vindicated, like I received justice for what he did for me. I felt like now I can breathe. Now I don't have to be worried. Now I know that you didn't really get away with it, and more importantly, that you can't do it to anyone else. And that's the most important thing to me. Karma had its day.
Though Natalie can never erase the horrors of what Kevin put her through, she uses her experience to educate others.
So from that day forward in the courtroom, I finally realized that my voice matters. My goal now is to change everyone else's life. Anyone that I can talk to, anyone that I can help, anyone that I can raise awareness to intimate partner violence, teen dating violence, domestic violence. Anyone who doesn't think that it matters, doesn't think that their life matters. So I talk to anyone who will listen.
Nearly 50 years later, an old fingerprint brings a killer into the light. The 1978 Omaha murder case, Nebraska. October 17, 1978. Omaha, Nebraska. A quiet apartment. A dead man. And somewhere inside that apartment, almost invisible to the human eye, a fingerprint was waiting. It would wait for decades. It would survive the passing of investigators, the closing of files, the fading of memories, and the disappearance of the world that existed around the crime. In 1978, that fingerprint meant almost nothing. In 2008, it would change everything. The victim was 61-year-old Carol Bonnet, a hospital employee who had lived an ordinary life in Omaha. There was no celebrity attached to his name, no political power, no fortune that made headlines across the country. He was simply a man living his life, going to work, returning home, and existing inside the routines that make up an ordinary human existence. Then, sometime before police arrived on October 17th, someone entered his apartment. What happened inside would leave Bonnet dead. The investigation would leave behind a collection of physical evidence. And one of those pieces of evidence would become a silent witness to the murder. For decades, nobody knew whose finger had touched that surface. Nobody knew whose hand had moved through the apartment. Nobody knew who had left the print behind. At the time, investigators did what they could with the technology available to them. They photographed the scene. They collected fingerprints. They recovered palm prints. They examined the apartment. They documented objects that appeared significant. And they began trying to reconstruct the final days of Carol Bonnet's life. But the technology of 1978 had limits. A fingerprint could exist, could be perfectly preserved. Investigators could photograph it. They could compare it against the records they had. And still come up with nothing. That was the cruel reality of forensic investigation in the late 1970s. The evidence could be there. The answer could be there. But the system might not yet have the ability to see it. Carol Bonnet's death became one of those cases. A murder with physical evidence. A murder with a crime scene. A murder with fingerprints. And yet no name. When firefighters and rescue personnel were called to Bonnet's apartment, they found him lying on the living room floor. The scene immediately raised the possibility that something far more serious than an accident had occurred. Police were called. The apartment became a crime scene. Bonnet was dead. The autopsy would determine that he had suffered a fatal stab wound to the abdomen. The pathologist estimated that he had already been dead for more than 48 hours. That meant investigators were not looking at a crime that had happened moments earlier. The apartment had already been silent. For more than 2 days, Carol Bonnet had been lying there while the outside world continued moving. People went to work. Cars passed through Omaha streets. Telephones rang. Businesses opened. People bought groceries. Life continued. Inside Bonnet's apartment, time had stopped. Investigators began working through the scene. They found empty beer cans. They found towels. They recovered other objects that could potentially reveal what had happened. And then there was the note. A message apparently left by the killer. It was not an apology. It was not an explanation. It was a taunt. The words were chilling in their simplicity. I am leaving this crime with one clue. Find it yourself. D. Pick. The message transformed the case. This was no longer simply a homicide scene. Someone appeared to be communicating directly with investigators. Someone had left behind a challenge. Find the clue. But what was the clue? The note itself? A fingerprint? Something hidden somewhere inside the apartment? Or something the killer believed investigators would never understand? The answer would remain buried for decades. Police carefully processed the apartment. Among the most important discoveries were latent fingerprints and palm prints recovered from the victim's bathroom. Investigators believed the killer may have attempted to clean blood or other evidence before leaving. And that possibility gave the fingerprints enormous significance. A bathroom. A place where someone might wash their hands. A place where someone might attempt to remove traces of a crime. A place where a person could unknowingly leave behind the one thing that might eventually identify them. The killer did not disappear completely. A part of him remained behind. Not in a photograph. Not in a confession. Not in a witness statement. In the pattern of a fingerprint. But in 1978, investigators had no way of knowing how valuable that print would eventually become. The victim's car was also taken. It was later recovered in Cicero, Illinois. And again, investigators collected additional latent prints. More evidence. More impressions. More fragments of a story. But no identity. The prints were searched through available fingerprint repositories. Requests were sent beyond Nebraska. Investigators attempted to determine whether the unknown prints belonged to someone already known to law enforcement. Nothing came back. No match. No suspect. No arrest. No courtroom. No final answer. The case went cold. For Carol Bonnet's family, however, the case never became cold. A police file can be placed inside a cabinet. A detective can be transferred. A laboratory can move on to another investigation. But grief does not follow administrative schedules. The dead do not become less dead because decades pass. And Carol Bonnet did not become less important because his name disappeared from daily headlines. He had been 61 years old. He had gone to work. He had lived inside a routine. He had a home. He had a life that existed before the crime. And then suddenly that life became a crime scene. The unanswered question was brutal. Who did this to him? For investigators in 1978, the answer remained beyond reach. The fingerprint was there. But the database capable of recognizing it did not yet exist. That distinction would become the entire story. Because sometimes a cold case is not truly missing evidence. Sometimes it is missing technology. The years passed. The 1970s became the 1980s. The 1980s became the 1990s. Omaha changed. America changed. The police department changed. Technology changed. And somewhere inside an evidence file, the fingerprints connected to Carol Bonnet's murder remained. They waited. 30 years is a lifetime. 30 years is long enough for children to become adults. Long enough for neighborhoods to change. Long enough for people who once knew the victim to grow old. Long enough for witnesses to forget details. Long enough for investigators who originally worked the case to retire. and long enough for the person responsible to believe the past had finally disappeared. But evidence does not always forget. A fingerprint has no memory. It does not age the way a human face does. It does not become nervous. It does not change its story. It simply remains what it was the moment it was left behind. And Carol Bonnet's case had one. A fingerprint waiting in the dark. Then came 2008. The Omaha Police Department's cold case unit received an inquiry concerning the Old Bonnet homicide. The case was still unsolved. The fingerprints were still there. And suddenly investigators had something they did not have in 1978. A technology capable of searching an enormous national database of fingerprint records. The system was called IAFIS, the Integrated Automated Fingerprint Identification System. It did not exist when Carol Bonnet was murdered. But now it did. The old evidence was taken out. The images were examined again. The question was simple. Could the fingerprint finally speak? The search began. And in less than 5 hours the system produced possible candidates. That moment must have felt almost impossible. For 30 years, the fingerprint had been an unidentified fragment. Now it had a possible name attached to it. Investigators did not simply accept the computer's suggestion. They examined the latent print carefully. They compared the evidence. They studied the ridge patterns. They reviewed the available records. Days were spent analyzing the match. And eventually one identification emerged. Jerry Watson. A man serving time in an Illinois correctional facility for burglary. The name changed the case. The fingerprint had finally led somewhere. But the investigators still needed to know whether that somewhere was the truth. A database hit could open a door. It could not by itself tell the entire story. Detective Douglas Hurrout became involved with the reopened investigation. The old evidence was reviewed again. Every piece mattered. The apartment. The fingerprints. The car. The note. The objects collected decades earlier. The investigators were no longer looking at a dead-end case. They were looking at an unfinished story. And the deeper they went, the more strange details began to connect. Among the original evidence was a thrifty nickel classified advertisement flyer. On one page, investigators found the name Jerry W. scribbled in handwriting. It was another fragment. Another connection. Another reason to keep digging. The man identified by the fingerprint had grown up in Cicero. He had moved repeatedly during his adult life. Investigators learned that he had a relative in Omaha, whom he had visited sometime during the fall of 1978. Suddenly, Omaha was no longer a random location on an old map. There was a possible connection. There was a fingerprint. There was a vehicle recovered in Illinois. There was a name written on an old advertisement. And there was a victim whose final days had remained unexplained for 30 years. The past had begun moving again. And this time the investigators had technology on their side. The old fingerprint had not changed. Only the world around it had. The evidence was eventually supplemented with forensic testing that had also been impossible in 1978. Items from the original scene were examined for DNA. Beer cans. Cigarette butts. Wastebasket contents. A severed telephone cord. Other physical evidence. Even the towels found near Bonnet were subjected to additional examination. The goal was no longer simply to identify a fingerprint. It was to determine whether the man identified by that fingerprint could be connected to the murder through multiple independent pieces of evidence. Because the victim deserved more than a computer match. He deserved an answer. And after 30 years, the investigation was finally capable of asking the right questions. Who was Jerry Watson in 1978? Why was he connected to Omaha? Why was his fingerprint inside Carol Bonnet's apartment? Why did physical evidence point back toward him? And why had the fingerprint remained unidentified for so long? The answers were beginning to form. But the tragedy at the center of the story remained unchanged. Carol Bonnet was still dead. No technology could reverse that. No database could return him to his apartment. No forensic test could restore the life that had been taken. Technology could only do one thing. It could speak for the dead. And Carol Bonnet had been waiting 30 years for someone to listen. The investigation eventually led authorities to obtain additional identification evidence from Watson. On December 2, 2009, investigators traveled to Illinois to obtain DNA evidence, fingerprints, and palm prints. The old latent fingerprint could now be examined alongside new reference evidence. The case that had once been trapped in 1978 was reaching across 3 decades. The fingerprint from the apartment. The records of a man in prison. The forensic evidence collected from the crime scene. The history of a suspect who had lived under aliases in different states. The relative in Omaha. The old classified advertisement. Piece by piece, the investigation was reconstructing a path that had been invisible in 1978. And the most haunting part was this. The clue had been there all along. The killer had apparently challenged police to find it. Decades later they did. The fingerprint had survived the passage of time. It survived the limitations of old technology. It survived the closing of the original investigation. It survived 30 years of silence. And eventually it pointed toward a name. The case that once seemed impossible to solve was no longer an unidentified murder. It had become a prosecution. A court would eventually hear the evidence. And the story of Carol Bonnet would move from a forgotten cold case into the legal record. But the most powerful part of the case was not the courtroom. It was the moment the past became visible again. Imagine the evidence room. An old file. Old photographs. Old fingerprints. Old objects collected from an apartment in 1978. For decades, those things had existed almost like archaeological remains. They belonged to another America. Another Omaha. Another era of policing. And then someone looked at the fingerprints again. The same ridges. The same patterns. The same hand. 30 years later. Nothing about the fingerprint had changed. The world had. The technology had. The database had. The investigators had. But the evidence had remained faithful. That is what makes cold cases so haunting. They do not always disappear. Sometimes they simply become silent. And silence can be mistaken for absence. Carol Bonnet's murder was never truly without a clue. It was without an answer. There is a difference. A clue can exist without being understood. A fingerprint can exist without a name. Evidence can exist without a technology capable of interpreting it. For 3 decades, the Bonnet case lived inside that gap. And for 3 decades, Carol's story remained unfinished. The tragedy was not only that a 61-year-old man was murdered. It was that the world continued moving while his final story remained frozen. His killer had apparently walked away. His car had traveled hundreds of miles. The physical evidence had crossed jurisdictions. The investigation had crossed generations. And still the fingerprint waited. When investigators finally matched it, the past did not feel distant anymore. It felt immediate. Because suddenly the question was no longer, who could have done this? The question became, what happened after the killer left? Where did he go? What did he do? How many times did he wake up and live an ordinary morning while knowing what had happened in Omaha? How many years passed before he realized that the evidence he left behind might someday become readable? And perhaps most disturbing of all, did he ever think about Carol Bonnet? The victim could not answer. The dead cannot testify. They cannot point to their killer. They cannot describe the final moments. They cannot explain why someone entered their home. They cannot tell investigators which object mattered. That is why physical evidence becomes so important. A fingerprint can become a witness. A strand of hair can become a witness. A fragment of DNA can become a witness. An old piece of paper can become a witness. And in Carol Bonnett's case, the fingerprint became one of the strongest voices left behind. The story also demonstrates how fragile an investigation can be when technology has not yet caught up with evidence. In 1978, investigators were not ignoring the fingerprint. They were trying to identify it with the tools available. They searched. They compared. They contacted other agencies. They followed leads. But there was no national automated system capable of doing what Yaffe's could later do. The fingerprint was not useless. It was simply waiting for the future. That is perhaps the most chilling thought in the entire case. Somewhere inside a police file, the identity of the killer may already have been encoded in the ridges of a single finger. But nobody could read it. Not yet. 30 years later they could. And suddenly the dead had a voice. The investigation eventually established the connection to Jerry Watson, and the legal process followed. The case was no longer merely a historical mystery. It had entered the courts. The evidence could be challenged. The identification could be examined. The history could be reconstructed. And Carol Bonnett could finally be remembered not simply as a name in an old homicide file, but as the man whose murder forced investigators to wait for technology to catch up with truth. His life should not be reduced to the night he died. He was 61 years old. He worked at a local hospital. He had a home. He had routines. He had relationships. He had decades of memories that existed before the crime. And then, in October 1978, violence entered that ordinary life. The newspapers could report the murder. The police could document the evidence. The courts could later address the accused. But none of them could fully restore what Carol had lost. That is the cruel mathematics of homicide. A killer can be identified. A case can be solved. A conviction can be obtained. But the victim does not return. The apartment becomes a location in a case file. The blood becomes evidence. The fingerprints become exhibits. The name becomes a headline. But behind all of it was a human being. Carol Bonnett. A man who expected another morning. A man who expected another day at work. A man who had no reason to believe that the ordinary routine of his life was approaching its final hours. And that is why cold cases matter. Not because they make good mysteries. Not because they provide dramatic headlines. Not because investigators enjoy reopening old files. They matter because every unanswered murder represents a life interrupted. Every unidentified fingerprint represents a victim whose story has not yet been completely told. And every old piece of evidence is a possibility. Carol Bonnett's case proved that possibility can survive for decades. The fingerprint did not become more accurate with age. It simply became more useful because the technology improved. In 1978, the print was an unidentified mark. In the 21st century, it became an identity. That transformation changed everything. The case became a lesson for law enforcement agencies across the country. Cold cases could be reopened. Old latent prints could be searched again. Evidence that once seemed exhausted could be tested with technologies that did not exist when the crime occurred. And somewhere, perhaps inside another evidence locker, another fingerprint might still be waiting. Another victim. Another apartment. Another forgotten file. Another person who believed time had erased the evidence. Carol Bonnett's murder reminds us that time does not necessarily destroy a case. Sometimes time only delays the moment when the evidence can finally be understood. The killer may leave the room. The car may disappear down a highway. The city may continue. The investigators may eventually close the file. But a fingerprint remains. It does not care whether 30 years pass. It does not care whether the detective retires. It does not care whether the neighborhood changes. It does not care whether the person responsible believes he has escaped history. The fingerprint simply waits. And when technology finally becomes capable of reading it, the silence can break. For Carol Bonnet, that silence lasted 3 decades. 30 years of uncertainty. 30 years of questions. 30 years in which his name belonged to a murder that had no clear answer. Then an old fingerprint was searched again. And the darkness began to lift. The words written by the killer decades earlier had demanded that police find the clue. They eventually did. Not in some hidden room. Not buried beneath the ground. Not inside a secret confession. The clue was sitting in the evidence. Waiting. A pattern of ridges. A silent signature. A piece of the killer that had been left behind without realizing what it might someday become. Nearly 50 years after Carol Bonnet's death, the world is very different from the Omaha he knew in 1978. The buildings have changed. The technology has changed. The police methods have changed. The people who remember that era have grown older. But the central truth has not changed. Carol Bonnet should have gone home. He should have had another ordinary evening. He should have had another morning. Instead, his life ended inside his own home, and an investigation began that would stretch across decades. His story is not remembered because he was famous. It is remembered because someone tried to erase what happened to him and failed. The evidence remained. The fingerprint remained. The case remained. And eventually the past caught up with the present. That is the haunting power of a cold case. Sometimes the dead are not forgotten. Sometimes they are simply waiting for someone to hear them. And Carol Bonnet had left behind a witness that could not speak for 30 years. A witness that had no voice. No face. No memory. Only ridges. Only a print. Only a silent mark left behind in a bathroom in Omaha. But silence does not mean disappearance. Sometimes silence is only patience. And after 30 years, that fingerprint finally spoke. October 17, 1978, began like any other day in Omaha. There was nothing on the streets to suggest that a murder had already occurred inside a quiet apartment. No police sirens. No flashing lights. No crowd gathered outside the building. Just an ordinary morning moving forward while, somewhere behind a closed door, a terrible secret was waiting to be discovered. Carol Bonnet was 61 years old. He worked at Clarkson Hospital. For the people who knew him, he was not a headline. He was a familiar face, a working man, someone whose absence from the daily routine could eventually become noticeable. And that is exactly what happened. Bonnet did not show up for work. One day might have been unusual. Several days were different. Employees became concerned. Someone needed to check on him. The apartment manager eventually went to Bonnet's residence. What the manager saw would transform a missing person concern into one of Omaha's most disturbing homicide investigations. Carol Bonnet was dead. He was found inside his apartment lying face down. He had suffered a fatal stab wound to the abdomen. The room that should have represented privacy and safety had become a crime scene. And immediately, investigators were confronted with a question that would remain unanswered for decades. Who had been inside? The first officers had to work carefully. Every object could matter. Every surface could contain evidence. Every unusual detail could become the beginning of a trail. The apartment contained clues that suggested the killer had not simply entered, attacked Bonnet, and disappeared. Something else had happened. The telephone cord had been severed. Bonnet's wallet was missing, His car was gone. And nearby were 3 towels containing hair and other biological material. The scene appeared chaotic, but investigators knew that chaos could contain structure. A criminal might believe he was destroying evidence. In reality, he might be creating it. That possibility became especially important when investigators examined the bathroom. Latent fingerprints and palm prints were recovered there. The evidence suggested that the killer may have attempted to clean blood or other identifying material before leaving. That detail would become critical, because washing one's hands might remove visible blood. It might remove some obvious traces. But it could also place a person's hands against surfaces that investigators would later examine. The killer may have been trying to erase himself from the apartment. Instead, he may have left part of his identity behind. A fingerprint. A palm print. A pattern of ridges that belonged to one person and one person only. But in 1978, a fingerprint was not automatically a name. Investigators had to work with the systems available to them. They photographed and processed the evidence. They searched known fingerprint repositories. They contacted other agencies. They sent requests beyond Nebraska. The result was silence. No match. No suspect. No identification. The print existed, but the identity behind it remained invisible. Then investigators discovered another disturbing detail. A note had been left near the body. It appeared to have been written by the killer. The message was not an attempt to hide. It was almost the opposite. It challenged investigators. I am leaving this crime with one clue. Find it yourself. D. Pick. The words were deliberately provocative. Whoever wrote them wanted police to know that a clue existed. But there was a deeper question. Did the killer know exactly what the clue was? Or was the message simply an act of arrogance? Perhaps the writer believed the police would never understand what had been left behind. Perhaps he believed the clue was hidden so well that it would never lead anywhere. And perhaps in 1978 he was right. Because the investigation began producing evidence without producing an identity. The fingerprints were there. The note was there. The missing car was there. But the person who had left them behind was gone. The stolen vehicle became another piece of the puzzle. Bonnet's car was eventually recovered in Cicero, Illinois. The vehicle had traveled far from Omaha. Illinois license plates had been placed on it. Investigators processed the car and recovered additional latent prints. Again there were traces. Again there were possibilities. Again there was no immediate answer. The distance between Omaha and Cicero suddenly mattered. The murder had not ended at the apartment door. The evidence had traveled. The killer had traveled. The investigation had crossed state lines. But the fingerprint remained the strongest silent witness. Investigators searched the available records. Nothing. The unknown prints did not match the known fingerprint repositories. The case began to slow. Then it stopped. And that is how a murder becomes a cold case. Not because investigators stop caring. Not because the victim becomes unimportant. But because every available path eventually reaches a wall. There was no usable eyewitness identification. There was no fingerprint match. There was no suspect who could be placed convincingly inside the apartment. There was no technology capable of searching the future databases that would eventually transform the investigation. The file went quiet. For Carol Bonnet, there would be no justice in the immediate aftermath of his death. His family and those who knew him were left with questions. The city continued. Omaha moved through another winter. Then another spring. The years began to accumulate. 1 year became 5. 5 became 10. 10 became 20. The case grew older. But the evidence did not. That distinction would become crucial. The people involved in the investigation aged. Technology changed. Police methods evolved. But the fingerprint remained exactly as it had been in 1978. A tiny pattern captured from a crime scene. A biological signature without a name. The killer, meanwhile, had every reason to believe the case was behind him. He had left Omaha. He had taken the victim's vehicle. He had crossed state lines. And the police had failed to identify him. Time itself seemed to become an ally. But time can also become a trap. Because every year that passes creates more technology, more databases, more records, more ways to compare old evidence against new information. And eventually, the technology that did not exist in 1978 would arrive. The FBI's Integrated Automated Fingerprint Identification System, known as IAFIS, would transform the way latent fingerprints could be searched. Instead of relying only on manual comparisons and limited repositories, investigators could search enormous collections of fingerprint records electronically. A fingerprint that had once been effectively anonymous could now be compared against a much larger universe of known prints. But nobody knew when that technology would matter to Carol Bonnet's case. For decades, the answer remained dormant. Then, in December 2008, an inquiry reached the Omaha Police Department concerning the Old Bonnet homicide. The case was still unsolved. The evidence was still available. And suddenly, investigators had a reason to look again. The Cold Case Unit contacted the crime laboratory. The old latent prints were brought back into focus. What had been examined in 1978 could now be searched with technology unavailable at the time of the murder. There was no guarantee. No promise. Just a possibility. A fingerprint sitting in an old case file might finally have somewhere to go. On December 19, 2008, crime laboratory technician Laura Casey searched the latent prints against IAFIS. The system began processing the evidence. The search did not take days. Did not take weeks. In less than 5 hours, IAFIS returned possible candidates. The old fingerprint had finally entered the modern world. But the computer's response was not the end. It was the beginning. A list of possible candidates does not automatically equal identification. A trained examiner still has to look. Compare. Question. Reject. Confirm. Casey spent days examining the latent print evidence against the candidates returned by the system. The process required expertise. A fingerprint is not a simple photograph. It is a pattern of ridges, characteristics, interruptions, and points of comparison. The examiner must determine whether the pattern recovered from a crime scene corresponds to the print of a known individual. The stakes were enormous. If the match was wrong, an innocent person could become the focus of a murder investigation. If the match was right, a 30-year-old homicide could finally have a suspect. Then one candidate stood out. Jerry Watson. A man who was serving time in an Illinois correctional facility on burglary charges. The name was suddenly attached to the fingerprint. For the first time since 1978, investigators had something they had never possessed before. Person. But the story was about to become even stranger. Investigators reviewed the original evidence again. They were not satisfied with a single clue. They wanted to know whether the old case contained anything else that connected Watson to Bonnet. And then they found something that seemed almost unbelievable. Among the old evidence was a thrifty nickel classified advertisement flyer. On one of its pages, someone had scribbled the name Jerry W. The note from the crime scene had challenged police to find the clue. Now, 30 years later, investigators had a fingerprint identifying Jerry Watson. And inside the original evidence was a piece of paper containing a name remarkably close to his. The old clue had been sitting there the entire time. It had not disappeared. It had not been destroyed. It had simply been overlooked. The investigators now had two separate threads. One came from modern fingerprint technology. The other came from an old piece of evidence collected during the original investigation. The two threads appeared to converge. But investigators still had to determine whether Jerry Watson had a genuine connection to Omaha. They began examining his background. The results added another layer to the case. Watson was originally from Cicero, Illinois, the same city where Bonnet's stolen car had been recovered. That coincidence alone could not prove murder. But investigators now had a fingerprint. They had a name. They had the classified advertisement. And they had a geographic connection. The old case was beginning to move. Then came another critical discovery. Watson had lived only a few blocks from where Bonnet's stolen vehicle had been recovered. 30 years earlier, that information might have meant nothing. Now, combined with the fingerprint evidence, it became significant. The case was no longer a collection of disconnected clues. The clues were beginning to form a path. Omaha. Carol Bonnet. The apartment. The bathroom. The latent fingerprint. The stolen car. Cicero. Jerry Watson. And the name written on an old classified advertisement. But there was still one problem. Watson was already in prison. And he was scheduled to be released. Investigators suddenly faced a deadline created by time itself. For 30 years, the suspect had been beyond their reach. Now they knew where he was. But he would soon be free. The cold case investigation had finally produced a name. And that name was about to walk out of prison. The detectives could not afford to wait. They needed to act. A warrant was obtained just days before Watson's scheduled release. The investigation that had been dormant for 3 decades suddenly became urgent. Detective Douglas Hurrout became involved in the case. The old evidence was reviewed. The laboratory findings were examined. The fingerprint identification was studied. The background investigation continued. And eventually, investigators traveled to Illinois. They were going to confront a man whose name had just been pulled from a fingerprint more than 30 years old. The detective had questions. Watson had answers. Or at least he would have the opportunity to provide them. Investigators questioned him about Carol Bonnet. Watson denied involvement. He denied knowing the victim. He denied being inside Bonnet's apartment. The denial was clear. But investigators now possessed something that had not existed in 1978. They could test the physical evidence again. DNA technology had advanced dramatically. Items collected decades earlier could be examined in ways that investigators in Omaha could not have imagined. The beer cans. The cigarette butts. The wastebasket contents. The severed telephone cord. The towels. The fingerprints. The car. The apartment. Every old object suddenly had the potential to answer a new question. Was Jerry Watson merely a fingerprint match? Or was he physically connected to the murder? That distinction would become decisive. Because a cold case cannot survive on suspicion alone. The victim's death demanded evidence. The investigators had found a fingerprint. They had found the name. They had found a geographical connection. Now they needed the science to tell them whether the pieces truly belonged to the same story. And somewhere inside the old evidence room, Carol Bonnet's final days were beginning to emerge from the darkness. For 30 years, the apartment had been silent. Now the evidence was speaking again. The fingerprint had given investigators a name. The old paper had given them a clue. The stolen car had given them a direction. And the science of the 21st century was about to determine whether those clues were enough to turn a name into a killer. The most remarkable part was that none of this required the killer to confess. He did not have to come forward. He did not have to remember what he had done. He did not have to tell investigators where he had been. The evidence had survived without him. And after 3 decades, it was finally being given another chance to speak. Carol Bonnet had been dead since October 1978. But his case was alive again. And this time the fingerprint had a name. The name was Jerry Watson. But a name was not enough. For 30 years, Carol Bonnet's murder had existed in the space between suspicion and proof. Investigators now had a fingerprint that pointed toward Watson, but they needed more. They needed evidence capable of surviving a courtroom. Evidence that could withstand questions from a defense attorney. Evidence that could explain not only who Watson was, but why his biological traces were appearing inside a dead man's apartment and inside the victim's stolen car. That distinction mattered. A fingerprint could place a person somewhere. DNA could tell a different story. And the old evidence from 1978 was about to become extraordinarily important. Investigators returned to the objects that had been collected when Bonnet's apartment was first processed. Some of them had been sitting untouched for decades. The evidence was no longer merely historical. Modern forensic science had transformed what investigators could ask from it. A cigarette but was no longer just a discarded cigarette. A beer can was no longer just an empty container. A strand of hair was no longer simply something found at a crime scene. Every object could potentially contain biological information. The investigators began testing. The first question was simple. Was Jerry Watson's DNA present? The answer would become devastating. Cigarette butts recovered from Bonnet's apartment contained DNA matching Watson. More cigarette butts found inside Bonnet's car also contained DNA matching Watson. The evidence was now reaching beyond fingerprints. It was biological. It was personal. And it was difficult to explain away. But the investigators continued. Because a strong case is not built from one piece of evidence. It is built from convergence. Different clues. Different methods. Different moments. All pointing toward the same conclusion. A fingerprint had identified Watson. Now DNA was placing him inside the apartment. And inside the stolen vehicle. The investigators examined the towels found near Bonnet's body. The towels were among the stranger details of the original crime scene. They contained hair and fecal matter. One of the hairs was determined to have come from Watson. Other biological material was identified as belonging to Bonnet. Suddenly, something recovered in a quiet Omaha apartment in 1978 had become a link to a man investigators had identified 3 decades later. The evidence had not changed. The science had. And that difference was enormous. Watson continued to deny involvement. He denied knowing Carol Bonnet. He denied being inside the apartment. He denied involvement in the murder. From his perspective, the passage of 30 years had created distance. Memory had faded. Witnesses had disappeared. People had died. The original investigation had gone cold. The apartment no longer existed in the same way in the public imagination. But the evidence had survived. And evidence has a dangerous relationship with time. People forget. Paper fades. Buildings disappear. But DNA can remain. Fingerprints can remain. Records can remain. And sometimes, a clue that appears insignificant in one decade becomes overwhelming in another. The investigators now had to reconstruct the connection between Watson and Omaha. He was not a random man whose fingerprint had somehow appeared in an old case. His background created another geographic link. Watson was originally from Cicero, Illinois. That fact became significant because Bonnet's stolen car had been recovered in Cicero. The vehicle had crossed state lines after the murder. And now investigators knew that the man identified through the fingerprint had a history connected to that same Illinois community. The pieces were becoming increasingly difficult to separate. Omaha. Cicero. The apartment. The car. The fingerprints. The cigarette butts. The hair. The old classified advertisement. The name Jerry W. And the man sitting in an Illinois prison. 30 years earlier, these details had existed independently. Now they were being placed next to each other. The picture was becoming clearer. But there was still another problem. The investigators had to explain the timeline. When did Watson arrive in Omaha? Why was he there? What was his relationship to Bonnet? Why were his fingerprints inside the apartment? Why was his DNA on cigarette butts inside the apartment in the victim's vehicle? And why was a hair matching Watson found on a towel near Bonnet's body? Each question led to another. And every answer had the potential to change the direction of the case. This was no longer simply an attempt to solve a mystery. It was an attempt to reconstruct a murder that had happened more than 3 decades earlier. The detectives were walking backward through time. They were taking evidence collected by investigators from another generation and trying to understand what it meant with modern technology. That required patience. It required skepticism. And above all, it required precision. Because in a courtroom, dramatic theories mean very little without evidence. The prosecution would eventually have to show a jury that the evidence formed a coherent chain. That chain began with Carol Bonnet, a 61-year-old man, a hospital employee, a man found dead in his own apartment, his telephone cord severed, his wallet missing, his car stolen, a note left behind, a bathroom containing latent fingerprints and palm prints, and a stolen vehicle later found in Illinois. The case had started with a body. Now, 33 years later, it was becoming a forensic puzzle. The investigators did not need to recreate every second of the crime. They needed to establish what the evidence could prove. The old fingerprint was particularly powerful because it was not simply a laboratory result created years later. It had been collected from the original crime scene. The print had existed before Watson became a suspect. That mattered. The identification was not generated because investigators already believed Watson was responsible. The fingerprint search produced Watson as a possible suspect. Then the investigators tested the other evidence. That sequence gave the investigation its strength. First came the unidentified print. Then the database. Then the identification. Then the corroborating evidence. The direction was from evidence to suspect, not suspect to evidence. And that difference would matter when the case reached court. The investigation also revealed that Watson had been incarcerated for burglary when investigators found him. He was serving time at the Lawrence Correctional Center in Illinois. That fact created an extraordinary moment in the history of the case. The man whose fingerprint had been sitting unidentified for 30 years was not hiding in some unknown location. He was already inside a prison. Law enforcement knew exactly where he was. But he was scheduled to be released. The clock was suddenly moving. Investigators obtained a warrant just days before his expected release. The cold case had become urgent. For 3 decades there had been no suspect to arrest. Now there was a suspect who could soon be outside prison walls. Detectives moved quickly. Watson was interviewed. He was confronted with the investigation. He was asked about Bonnet. He denied involvement. He denied knowing the victim. He denied being inside the apartment. But the detectives were no longer working from the uncertainty of 1978. They had the fingerprint. They had DNA. They had the hair. They had the car. They had the old evidence. And they had time. 30 years of time. Time to compare. Time to test. Time to verify. Time to reconstruct. The murder had once seemed like a single violent event that vanished into the past. Now investigators were discovering that it had left a trail extending across decades. The trail did not run in a straight line. It moved from Omaha to Illinois, from an apartment to a stolen vehicle, from fingerprints to DNA, from a handwritten clue to an automated database, from a 1978 crime scene to a 2008 cold case unit, and finally toward a courtroom. But before that courtroom could exist, investigators needed to understand the significance of the physical evidence. Consider the cigarette butts. They were ordinary objects, something someone might smoke and discard without a second thought. But in a murder investigation, ordinary objects can become extraordinary. The DNA on those cigarettes connected Watson to the apartment, and similar evidence connected him to the car. The victim's stolen vehicle was not merely a missing automobile. It became another crime scene, another location where biological evidence could be preserved, another place where Watson's presence could be examined. The apartment and the car were separated by hundreds of miles. Yet both contained evidence associated with the same man. The probability of coincidence became harder to ignore. Then there was the hair. A single strand. Something almost invisible. Something that could easily have been overlooked by someone leaving a crime scene. But the hair found on one of the towels near Bonnet's body was determined to be Watson's. That did not by itself explain exactly how the hair got there. But it added another physical connection. The fingerprint placed Watson's hand in the apartment. The DNA placed him on cigarette butts in the apartment and car. The hair placed his biological material on a towel near the victim. The stolen vehicle connected the crime to Cicero. And the investigation found that Watson had roots in Cicero. The old evidence was no longer whispering. It was beginning to speak in several voices at once. The defense would later challenge the evidence. Watson would maintain his innocence. The passage of time itself became part of the legal argument. 33 years had passed. Witnesses had died. Memories had disappeared. Some people who might have been available in 1978 were no longer available when the case finally reached court. That created an unusual legal problem. How do you prosecute a murder after more than 3 decades? How do you reconstruct testimony when the original investigators may no longer be available? How do you defend yourself against a case built partly from evidence collected before many modern forensic technologies existed? The courtroom would eventually have to confront those questions. But the prosecution had something that investigators in 1978 never possessed: science. And science had transformed the case. The evidence was not dependent entirely on memory. It was not dependent entirely on a witness saying, "I remember seeing him." It was physical. Could be tested. Could be examined. Could be challenged. And it could be presented to a jury. The old fingerprint became a central turning point. For decades it had been an unidentified mark. Then IAFIS searched it. In less than 5 hours the system returned possible candidates. Laboratory personnel spent days comparing the latent print to those candidates. Eventually Watson was positively identified. The FBI later recognized the work with its Latent Hit of the Year award, honoring the Omaha investigators and laboratory personnel responsible for using IAFIS to advance the case. A technology that did not exist when Bonnet was murdered had helped identify the suspect. That fact alone was remarkable. But the case would become even more significant because the fingerprint was not the only thing technology could reveal. DNA had become another language. And the evidence from 1978 could now be translated into that language. The result was a case that crossed generations. The investigators who first stood inside Bonnet's apartment had collected evidence according to the standards of their time. The investigators who reopened the case decades later looked at that same evidence through a completely different scientific lens. The original investigators had not failed because they lacked dedication. They lacked the technology. The distinction is important. The fingerprint was not ignored. It was searched. The evidence was not simply thrown into storage and forgotten. The case had been investigated, but the suspect remained outside the limits of the available databases. That was what made the later identification so powerful. The answer had not suddenly appeared. It had been waiting. Watson was eventually charged in Nebraska. The charge transformed the case again. For the first time, the state would have to present the entire story in a courtroom. The prosecution would have to explain why Watson's fingerprints were connected to Bonnet's apartment, why his DNA was present, why his hair was found near the victim, why the stolen car was recovered in Cicero, why the old evidence contained the name Jerry W., and why the accumulated evidence pointed to one man. Watson would have the right to challenge every part of that story. The jury would have to listen. The evidence would have to survive scrutiny. And after 33 years, the murder of Carol Bonnet would finally be placed before 12 people who had never known him. That is one of the strangest features of a cold case. The victim's life becomes history. The investigators become history. The crime scene becomes history. But eventually, a jury must sit in the present and decide what happened in the past. In August 2011, that moment arrived. Jerry Watson faced a jury for the murder of Carol Bonnet. The evidence was no longer locked inside an old police file. It was being described in open court. The fingerprints, the DNA, the hair, the cigarette butts, the car, the old note. The evidence gathered in an apartment in 1978. The technology that revived it in 2008. And the investigation that followed. For 10 days, testimony unfolded. 10 days of evidence about a murder that had occurred 33 years earlier. The jury was being asked to cross that enormous distance in time. To imagine the Omaha of 1978. To consider a victim they had never met. To examine evidence that had survived for decades. And to determine whether the state had proved that Jerry Watson was responsible. The defense challenged the prosecution's case. But the physical evidence remained. The fingerprint remained. The DNA remained. The hair remained. The connection between the apartment and the car remained. The case had begun with an unknown man leaving an unidentified fingerprint. It had become a decades-long investigation. And now it was approaching its final decision. Carol Bonnet had waited 33 years for the courtroom. His killer, according to the prosecution, had left behind the very evidence that would eventually lead investigators back to him. A fingerprint. A biological trace. A strand of hair. Small things. Almost meaningless in isolation. Together they formed a path. And that path had finally led to a jury. On the other side of the courtroom sat a man who had denied knowing Bonnet. On the other side of the evidence sat a dead man who could no longer tell his own story. The jury had to decide which story the evidence supported. And somewhere beneath all the forensic terminology, all the legal arguments, and all the questions about evidence from another era, there remained one simple fact. Carol Bonnet had been alive in Omaha in October 1978. Then he was dead. Someone had entered his world. Someone had left. Someone had taken his car. Someone had left behind a note challenging police to find the clue. And someone had unknowingly left a fingerprint. For 30 years that fingerprint had no name. Then technology gave it one. Jerry Watson. The case had finally reached the point where a jury could answer the question that investigators had been asking since the day Bonnet's body was discovered. Who killed Carol Bonnet? The answer would not come from a confession. It would not come from a dramatic eyewitness appearance. It would come from evidence that had been waiting longer than anyone expected. And after 3 decades of silence, The fingerprint had finally brought the past into the courtroom. The courtroom was now carrying a burden that had been waiting for more than 3 decades. 33 years had passed since Carol Bonnet was found dead in his Omaha apartment. 33 years since the telephone cord had been cut. 33 years since the stolen car disappeared from Nebraska. 33 years since investigators lifted fingerprints from the apartment and placed them into evidence. And 33 years since a killer had apparently left behind a message challenging police to find the clue. Now, in August 2011, Jerry Watson sat before a jury. The old case had become a living proceeding. The evidence was no longer hidden inside a police file. It was being placed in front of 12 people who had never known Carol Bonnet. The jury would hear how Bonnet had been found. They would hear about the apartment. They would hear about the missing wallet. They would hear about the stolen vehicle. They would hear about the fingerprints. They would hear about DNA. And they would hear about a tiny biological trace that investigators believed placed Watson beside Bonnet at the time of the murder. The defense had a fundamental argument. 33 years was an extraordinary amount of time. Memories disappear.
Witnesses die.
Records are lost. People move. Evidence can become difficult to interpret. And the longer a case remains unresolved, the harder it becomes to reconstruct the world in which the crime actually happened. Watson's defense argued that the passage of time had compromised his ability to defend himself. Some witnesses from the original investigation were no longer available. Some people connected to the case had died. Others could no longer remember what they had seen or heard in 1978. The defense also attacked the meaning of the physical evidence. Yes, Watson's fingerprints were found inside Bonnet's apartment. Yes, his DNA appeared on cigarette butts. Yes, biological evidence connected him to objects associated with the crime. But when had he been there? That question became central. Because finding someone's DNA in a place does not automatically tell you when it was deposited. A person could visit an apartment days earlier. A cigarette could remain in an ashtray. A fingerprint could remain on a surface. A hair could theoretically be transferred at another time. The defense suggested that the evidence did not necessarily prove Watson was present at the exact moment Bonnet was killed. It was a serious argument. The prosecution needed something stronger. Something that could connect Watson not simply to the apartment but to the murder itself. And that was where the towel became critical. 3 towels had been found near Bonnet's body. They contained hair and fecal matter. At first glance, they were simply disturbing objects at a disturbing crime scene. But forensic testing decades later transformed one of those hairs into one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case. The hair was determined to contain DNA matching Jerry Watson. And its location mattered. It was not simply found somewhere inside the apartment. It was associated with a towel lying near Bonnet's naked body. The prosecution argued that the location of that hair was not consistent with an innocent, unrelated visit. It placed Watson physically close to the victim. Close to the body. Close to the moment investigators believed the murder occurred. The scientific evidence became the bridge between presence and timing. The court record later described the DNA profile from the hair as one that would fit only approximately 1 in 37.6 million Caucasians. That number was enormous. But numbers alone do not tell a story. The story came from where the hair was found. A towel. Near the body. Containing biological material associated with Watson. The prosecution argued that the logical inference was that Watson had been inside Bonnet's apartment at the time of the murder. The defense had another explanation. Perhaps Watson had been inside the apartment earlier. Perhaps he had been there with one of 2 other suspects who had previously lived in Bonnet's apartment. Perhaps those individuals had access to Bonnet's car. Perhaps Watson's DNA had been deposited before the murder. The defense did not need to prove an alternative killer. It needed only to create reasonable doubt. That is the difficult terrain of circumstantial evidence. The prosecution does not necessarily need an eyewitness. A murder can be reconstructed from physical traces. But every trace has to be interpreted. Every connection has to be tested. Every reasonable alternative has to be considered. The jury listened. 10 days of testimony unfolded. Witnesses described the original crime scene. Investigators explained how evidence had been collected. Forensic specialists discussed fingerprints and DNA. The chain of custody was examined. The defense challenged the government's interpretation. The prosecution returned again and again to the same physical reality. Carol Bonnet had been murdered. The killer had been inside the apartment. Watson's fingerprint was inside the apartment. Watson's DNA was found on cigarette butts inside the apartment. Watson's DNA was also found on cigarette butts in Bonnet's car. And Watson's hair was found on the towel beside Bonnet's body. The evidence was not one isolated clue. It was a network. Each piece pointed toward a different part of the same story. The fingerprints suggested presence. The cigarette DNA suggested presence in both the apartment and the vehicle. The hair connected Watson to the towel near Bonnet's body. The stolen car connected the murder scene to Cicero, Illinois. And Watson had a connection to Cicero. The prosecution did not have a confession. It did not have a surviving eyewitness who could describe the killing. Instead, it had evidence. Old evidence. Evidence that had survived long enough to become modern evidence. That was the strange heart of the case. The murder occurred in an era when forensic science was much more limited. The trial occurred in an era when DNA databases and automated fingerprint systems had transformed criminal investigations. The jury was therefore being asked to look backward using tools from the future. The defense attacked that process. How could anyone know what happened in 1978 with absolute certainty? How could the jury know exactly when Watson had been inside the apartment? How could they know that his DNA was not from some earlier encounter? How could they trust evidence collected more than 3 decades earlier? These questions mattered. But the prosecution had an answer. The evidence did not have to prove every second of the crime. It had to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And the location of Watson's hair became the critical link. The hair was not merely somewhere inside Bonnet's home. It was on a towel near the victim. And the towel contained fecal material associated with Bonnet. The prosecution argued that the circumstances surrounding the hair made an innocent explanation extremely unlikely. The Supreme Court of Nebraska would later agree that the evidence was sufficient for a rational jury to conclude Watson was present in Bonnet's apartment at the time of the murder. The court described the location of the hair as crucial. The evidence placed Watson next to the naked body of the victim. That was the moment the case moved beyond a simple fingerprint identification. The fingerprint had found the suspect. The DNA helped establish his presence. The hair helped connect that presence to the murder itself. And then there was the weapon. Bonnet had suffered a single fatal stab wound to his abdomen. The telephone cord had been severed. His wallet and cash were missing. His car had been taken. The prosecution argued that the circumstances were consistent with robbery and murder. The amended charge allowed the jury to consider first-degree murder either on a theory of premeditation or felony murder during the attempted or completed commission of a robbery. The defense continued to challenge the state's interpretation. But the physical evidence remained. A fingerprint does not forget where it was found. DNA does not remember the calendar. A hair cannot explain itself. The jury had to decide what those pieces meant when assembled together. For the people in that courtroom, Carol Bonnet was no longer simply a name from 1978. He became a person whose final hours had to be reconstructed. A man who had been found naked and face down on the floor of his apartment. A man whose life had ended from a single stab wound. A man whose wallet was gone. A man whose car was taken. a man whose telephone had been deliberately disconnected, and a man whose killer had apparently believed that the police would never solve the crime. The old note became another haunting element. The message claimed that one clue had been left behind. The killer challenged investigators to find it. For 30 years, the challenge seemed unanswered. Then the fingerprint search changed the entire case. The old clue was no longer invisible. The technology of IAFIS had transformed an anonymous latent print into the name Jerry Watson. And when investigators revisited the original evidence, they discovered the thrifty nickel advertisement with Jerry W. written on it. It was an eerie coincidence. Or perhaps something more. The prosecution treated it as another link in the chain. The defense could challenge its meaning. But the fingerprint was different. It had been collected from the crime scene long before Watson became a suspect. The DNA was different. It was biological evidence recovered from objects that had been preserved since 1978. The hair was different. It was tied to the towel near Bonnet's body. One clue could be questioned. Several independent clues pointing in the same direction were harder to dismiss. The trial lasted 10 days. Then the evidence was complete. The arguments were made. The jury withdrew. And suddenly, after 33 years, the case was in the hands of 12 people. The detectives who had reopened the investigation could do nothing more. The laboratory could do nothing more. The technology could do nothing more. The fingerprints had spoken. The DNA had spoken. The witnesses had spoken. Now the jury had to decide. For Carol Bonnet's family, this was not merely the end of a legal process. It was the end of a question that had haunted them for more than 3 decades. Who killed Carol? Who entered his home? Who stabbed him? Who took his car? Who left the note? Who left the fingerprint? The answer had taken 33 years to reach a courtroom. But the jury did not have 33 years. They had the evidence. They had the testimony. They had the arguments. And they had to decide whether those pieces established guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The deliberation ended. The verdict came back. Guilty. Jerry Watson was convicted of first-degree murder. He was also convicted of using a deadly weapon to commit a felony. The words carried an enormous weight. After 3 decades, the murder of Carol Bonnet had finally produced a criminal conviction. But the story was not over. Because a guilty verdict does not erase a crime. It does not return a victim. It does not restore the missing years. It does not undo the fear experienced by the people who knew Bonnet. It only establishes accountability under the law. On October 17, 2011, exactly 33 years after Bonnet's body was discovered, Watson was sentenced. Life in prison for the murder. And an additional sentence of 10 to 20 years for the use of a deadly weapon. The date itself was striking. October 17, 1978. October 17, 2011. The same date. 33 years apart. On one date, investigators discovered a body. On the other, a court formally imposed punishment on the man convicted of killing him. The symmetry was almost impossible to ignore. But there was something else about that date. 33 years earlier, Carol Bonnet had been discovered by the apartment manager after failing to report to work. 33 years later, the legal system closed one of the longest chapters of the case. The fingerprint had done what no eyewitness could. It had survived. It had waited. And it had eventually pointed investigators toward the man the jury would convict. But Watson did not simply disappear into the legal system without resistance. He appealed. The defense argued that the 33-year delay had denied Watson a fair trial. The argument was not trivial. The passage of time had undeniably changed the case. Witnesses were gone. Memories were gone. Evidence had to be interpreted decades after collection. The defense argued that this made it impossible for Watson to receive the full protection of the law. The Nebraska Supreme Court considered the issue. And in 2013, the court rejected the challenge. The court held that Watson had not shown that the state intentionally delayed prosecution to gain an unfair tactical advantage. The convictions were affirmed. The court also examined the sufficiency of the evidence. Again, the conclusion was significant. The evidence was enough for a rational jury to find Watson guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The fingerprints, the DNA, the hair, the location of the hair, the circumstances of the murder, the stolen car, the connection to Cicero, the missing wallet, the severed telephone cord. Together, they formed a case the court found sufficient. For a crime that had remained unsolved for 30 years, the legal conclusion was clear. The cold case was solved. But the emotional story was much more complicated. Because solving a murder does not mean understanding everything. There were still questions. Why Carol Bonnet? What exactly happened inside the apartment? What was said between the victim and the killer? What was the final conversation? Did Bonnet recognize the person standing near him? Did he know danger was coming? Did he realize his life was ending? No forensic database can answer those questions. No fingerprint can reconstruct a conversation. No DNA profile can tell us what a victim felt during his final moments. That part of the story remains silent. And perhaps that is what makes the case so haunting. The investigators eventually identified the man responsible. The courts confirmed the conviction. But Carol Bonnet's final experience remains locked inside October 1978. The evidence can tell us where Watson had been. It can tell us that his biological traces were present. It can tell us that his fingerprint was recovered from the apartment. It can tell us that his DNA was found on cigarette butts and on a hair near Bonnet's body. But it cannot tell us what Carol saw. That is the boundary of forensic science. It can recover the past, cannot completely recreate it. And yet, for 33 years, the evidence had been waiting for exactly this moment. The fingerprint was not a dramatic object. It was not a weapon. It was not a confession. It was only a pattern left by a human hand. But that pattern became a bridge across time. From a bathroom in Omaha to an FBI database. From an unidentified print to a suspect. From a suspect to DNA. From DNA to a courtroom. And from a courtroom to a conviction. The case became an example of what happens when old evidence meets new technology. A murder can remain unsolved for decades without being truly forgotten. A clue can remain unidentified without being useless. A victim can remain without justice without being without hope. Because sometimes the future eventually catches up with the past. And when it does, the smallest detail can become the most important. A fingerprint. A cigarette. A strand of hair. A towel. A name written on an old advertisement. Objects that seemed insignificant in 1978 became pieces of a story in 2011. Carol Bonnet's life had ended in violence. But the evidence he left behind continued moving. For decades it moved silently. Then suddenly it moved faster than anyone expected. And eventually it reached the courtroom. Jerry Watson was convicted. He was sentenced to life. The appeal was rejected. The case had reached its legal conclusion. But the fingerprint remained what it had always been. A silent record of a moment. A mark left behind by someone who never expected that technology would someday read it. That is the strange power of forensic evidence. The killer can walk away. The years can pass. The city can change. The witnesses can disappear. But evidence can wait. And in the case of Carol Bonnet, it waited 30 years before giving investigators the name they had been searching for. The clue was never gone. It was simply unread. Until someone looked again. After the verdict, the courtroom became quieter. The legal question had been answered. Jerry Watson had been convicted. The sentence had been imposed. The appeals had begun. But outside the courtroom, another reality remained. Carol Bonnet was still dead. The apartment where his final hours had unfolded was no longer simply a place in Omaha. It had become a point on a map of memory. A location connected to a murder that had taken 33 years to solve. And perhaps the most unsettling part was how ordinary everything had been before the violence. There had been no warning that October morning. No public alarm. No reason for anyone outside the apartment to suspect what had happened. Bonnet had simply failed to appear at work. That absence became the first signal that something was wrong. Then the door opened. And an ordinary home became a homicide scene. That transition is one of the darkest elements of violent crime. The world does not always announce that a tragedy is about to happen. Sometimes it arrives quietly. A missed shift. A telephone that stops working. Car that disappears. A neighbor who notices something unusual. Then a door opens. And everything changes. In Bonnet's case, the evidence would eventually reveal a crime involving movement. The killer did not simply leave the apartment and vanish. The stolen car carried the investigation away from Omaha. It became a physical connection between Nebraska and Illinois. The vehicle was eventually recovered in Cicero. That journey mattered because Cicero was not merely a random stopping point. It was connected to Jerry Watson. He had been raised there. He had lived there. He knew the area. And investigators learned that he had connections in Omaha as well. The vehicle therefore became more than transportation. It became a silent witness to what happened after the murder. A car cannot tell investigators what happened inside it. But it can tell them where it went. It can preserve fingerprints. It can preserve DNA. It can preserve the physical traces of people who entered it. And in this case, those traces mattered. The car carried Bonnet's story beyond Nebraska. By the time it was found in Illinois, the murder had already crossed a state line. The investigation would eventually follow. That is one of the reasons the case became so difficult. In 1978, law enforcement agencies were more dependent on local records and direct communication. A suspect could move. A stolen vehicle could cross state lines. Evidence could remain in one jurisdiction, while a possible suspect lived in another. The investigation could lose momentum simply because the information was fragmented. 30 years later, databases changed that equation. The FBI's fingerprint system could connect an old latent print with records far beyond Omaha. The geographic boundaries that had once separated investigations became less significant. The fingerprint did not care about state lines. Neither did DNA. The evidence could travel electronically. And that changed the meaning of old crime scenes. A fingerprint lifted in Nebraska could eventually be compared with a print belonging to someone incarcerated in Illinois. The technology created a bridge that investigators in 1978 did not have. But there was another bridge. Human memory. The investigators who reopened the case had to understand what the original detectives had done. They had to interpret old reports. They had to examine photographs. They had to locate evidence that might have been stored for decades. They had to understand the language of another era. Every cold case creates this problem. The new investigator must become familiar with a world that no longer exists. They must reconstruct decisions made by people they may never meet. They must determine why certain evidence was collected. Why other evidence was not collected. Why certain suspects were investigated. Why others disappeared from the file. In Bonnet's case, the original detectives had preserved enough physical evidence for future technology to matter. That was critical. Without the fingerprints, Ioffi's could not have helped. Without the cigarette butts, modern DNA testing could not have helped. Without the towels, the hair evidence could not have helped. Without careful preservation, the future would have had nothing to examine. This is one of the hidden lessons of cold cases. The investigation does not end when the file is closed. Evidence can continue aging inside a box. But if it is preserved correctly, it can become more valuable over time. Technology changes. Methods improve. Databases expand. A clue that could not be interpreted in one generation may become decisive in another. That is precisely what happened here. The fingerprint was useful in 1978. But it was not enough. In the years that followed, fingerprint technology became dramatically more powerful. Ioffi's allowed investigators to search a far larger collection of prints. And suddenly the old evidence had a new life. That process is easy to overlook when looking at the final verdict. People often remember the dramatic moment. The suspect identified. The arrest. The trial. The conviction. But the real breakthrough began much earlier. Someone had preserved the evidence. Someone had maintained the records. Someone had kept the old fingerprint available. Without that chain, there would have been no later miracle. The case also reveals something uncomfortable about the concept of a perfect crime. A crime may appear perfect only because the available technology cannot expose its weaknesses. The killer may believe the absence of a match means the absence of evidence. But those are not the same thing. No match does not mean no fingerprint. No DNA database hit does not mean no DNA. No suspect does not mean no suspect exists. It can simply mean that the system has not caught up yet. For Jerry Watson, the past eventually did. The fingerprint that had once been anonymous became a name. Then the name became a suspect. Then the suspect became a defendant. And the defendant became a convicted murderer. The chain took 33 years. But it was unbroken. The physical evidence remained at the center. That is what made the case different from many cold cases that depend almost entirely on fading memories. There was something tangible. Something that could be examined again. Something that could be tested. Something that could be compared. Something that could survive an argument in court. The fingerprints were especially powerful because they were connected to the original crime scene. They were not created by investigators decades later. They had been sitting there since 1978. The same ridges. The same pattern. The same human hand. The only thing that changed was the ability to identify it. That is why the fingerprint became symbolic of the entire case. It represented the difference between evidence and understanding. The evidence had existed. The understanding had not. Until 2008. And when investigators finally understood what they were looking at, they did not stop. They tested. They compared. They questioned. They looked for corroboration. They built a case. The result was not simply a technological success. It was an investigative success. Technology produced the lead. Human beings turned the lead into an investigation. Laboratory specialists examined the evidence. Detectives reconstructed the history. Prosecutors presented the case. A jury evaluated it. And the courts reviewed the result. That entire process matters because forensic technology is not magic. A computer can suggest a match. Cannot explain a murder. It cannot tell investigators why the suspect was there. It cannot determine motive. It cannot reconstruct a conversation. It cannot replace human judgment. The fingerprint system opened the door. Investigators had to walk through it. And once they did, the case revealed another layer. The old classified advertisement. The name Jerry W. It was an extraordinary detail because it existed before investigators had any reason to focus on Watson. The handwriting had been preserved as part of the original evidence. Decades later, investigators could look at it again with a completely different perspective. That is another feature of cold cases. Evidence changes meaning when new information arrives. A piece of paper that seems irrelevant can become important after a suspect is identified. A location that once seemed random can become significant after a geographic connection is discovered. A fingerprint that once produced no result can become decisive after a database expands. The evidence itself does not change. The context changes. And context can transform an insignificant object into a crucial clue. The thrifty nickel flyer was one such object. It had been part of the physical world surrounding the murder. A name had been written on it. For years, the significance was unclear. Then the fingerprint search produced Jerry Watson. Suddenly, the old handwriting became another thread. The investigators were not simply solving a murder. They were decoding a crime scene preserved in fragments. Every fragment belonged to a different moment. The fingerprint belonged to the apartment. The cigarette belonged to the person who smoked it. The hair belonged to a human body. The car belonged to the victim. The flyer belonged to the investigation. The prison record belonged to the suspect. Together they created a timeline. Not a perfect timeline. Not a complete reconstruction. But enough to establish a direction. And perhaps that is all a cold case needs. One direction. One opening. One clue that leads to another. Then another. Until a case that once seemed frozen begins moving again. The legal process would eventually confirm the strength of that chain. But even after the conviction, unanswered questions remained. There is no complete record of every moment inside Bonnet's apartment. There is no surviving recording of the conversation. There is no definitive explanation for every object found at the scene. There is no way to ask Carroll what he saw. Those gaps are permanent. The courtroom can establish legal responsibility. It cannot restore history in perfect detail. That distinction is important. A solved murder does not necessarily become a completely understood murder. Sometimes the identity of the killer is known while the full emotional story remains unknown. That is what happened here. The legal system could answer one question. Who was responsible? Could not answer every question. Why did the violence happen? What exactly happened between Bonnet and Watson? What were the final words? What was the final thought? Those questions remain beyond forensic science. And perhaps that is where the human tragedy of the case becomes clearest. For decades, investigators were searching for a name. But Carroll Bonnet's family was living with a much simpler absence. They were living without him. A verdict cannot change that. A sentence cannot change that. An FBI award cannot change that. The fingerprints cannot change that. Technology can identify a killer. Cannot restore a victim. That is the line that every cold case eventually reaches. Justice can arrive late. Sometimes extraordinarily late. But it cannot reverse time. Carroll Bonnet never saw the fingerprint match. He never knew that his killer's identity would eventually emerge from a national database. He never saw the detectives reopen his case. He never saw the evidence tested with modern DNA techniques. He never heard the verdict. He never saw the sentence. All of those moments belong to people living decades after his death. And yet, every one of them existed because of what happened to him. The investigation was his story continuing after his life had ended. That may be the most important way to understand a cold case. The victim's life stops. The case does not. The investigation carries the victim's name forward. The evidence carries the victim's last known moments forward. The detectives carry the unanswered question forward. And sometimes years later the courts carry it to a verdict. Carol Bonnett's name traveled from a 1978 homicide report to a modern forensic database. From a police file to a courtroom. From an unidentified fingerprint to a convicted murderer. That journey lasted 33 years. But it was not simply a journey toward punishment. It was a journey toward recognition. Recognition that the murder had happened. Recognition that the victim had not been forgotten. Recognition that the evidence had been preserved. Recognition that someone had finally been held responsible. The case also left a message for investigators working cold cases today. Never assume old evidence is worthless. Never assume an unidentified fingerprint will remain unidentified forever. Never assume that a biological sample tested decades later has nothing new to say. Technology changes. Databases grow. Scientific methods improve. A case that cannot be solved today may be solvable tomorrow. That does not guarantee justice. But it creates possibility. And possibility is sometimes all a cold case has. For Carol Bonnett, that possibility survived for more than 30 years. It survived inside fingerprints. Inside cigarette butts. Inside a strand of hair. Inside a vehicle recovered hundreds of miles away. Inside a piece of paper with a name written on it. The clues did not form a perfect picture. They formed fragments. Investigators had to assemble them. And once they did, the past became visible. The killer had not disappeared completely. He had left something behind. A biological trace. A fingerprint. Connection. A name. And the future eventually found it. That is why the case remains haunting. Not because the killer escaped forever. He did not. Not because the evidence vanished. It did not. The haunting part is that the answer was there all along. For 30 years, the truth existed inside the evidence. But nobody could read it. Then technology changed. And suddenly, the smallest mark in an old Omaha apartment became powerful enough to cross 3 decades. It crossed the distance between 1978 and 2008. It crossed the distance between a crime scene and a prison. It crossed the distance between an unidentified fingerprint and a defendant. And eventually, it crossed the final distance between suspicion and conviction. Carol Bonnett's murder began with an ordinary absence. A man did not show up for work. Someone became concerned. A door opened. A body was discovered. The investigation began. The clues were collected. The fingerprint was lifted. And then the years came. One after another. Until the case was almost forgotten by everyone except those who refused to let it disappear. But the evidence remained. And when investigators finally returned to it, the case moved again. That is the quiet lesson hidden beneath the sensational headline. Cold cases do not always need a miracle. Sometimes they need patience, preservation, new technology, and someone willing to look at an old piece of evidence one more time. In 1978, Carol Bonnett's killer walked away. In 2008, a fingerprint pointed investigators toward him. In 2011, a jury found Jerry Watson guilty. 33 years after the murder, the legal system finally delivered its answer. But the fingerprint had delivered its own answer long before the courtroom. It had simply been waiting for someone capable of hearing it. And perhaps that is the most haunting image left behind by the case. Not the courtroom. Not the prison sentence. Not even the murder scene. A single fingerprint. Frozen in time. A mark left behind by a human hand. A silent witness sitting in an evidence file while the world changed around it. It did not speak in 1978. It did not speak in 1988. It did not speak in 1998. But in 2008, technology finally gave it a voice. And when it spoke, it gave investigators a name. The name led to a prison. The prison led to an investigation. The investigation led to DNA. The DNA led to a courtroom. And the courtroom led to a verdict. For Carol Bonnet, justice arrived 33 years late. But it arrived because one small piece of evidence refused to disappear. The victim was gone. The killer was still alive. The investigators were different. The technology was different. The city was different. But the fingerprint was exactly the same. And that is why, decades after the murder, the smallest trace left behind inside an Omaha apartment became louder than 3 decades of silence.